Strikes me as being a positively destructive thing. If you hope to raise a generation, as people on the left often do, they hope to raise a generation of activists. It seems to me that you could do nothing worse than to make their first experience with activism a futile gesture on a local level in an attempt to influence national policy, rather than focus on something that you can do where you are. Now, Bill, we are conservatives. We are small government people. We are individual liberty people. We are individual responsibility people. Is there some kind of message that you wish you could get to these kids to say, I know you're upset. I'm upset. Here's where we can start.
Well, yeah. I mean, to the degree that you're right about the inability of either side to listen to an argument, but you could, I think, address this in a less confrontational way. And if it were me, I would basically say this, which I believe I'm going to do a firewall on this. I would say, listen, your theory is, can we both agree, both sides agree that we'd like this to stop? Can we at least start there, right? That both of us are just horrified by this and we'd like to see it stop. So can we at least start with the assumption that we're both trying to solve the same problem? Your assertion is that easy access to guns is what's causing these shootings, and if we could simply make guns harder to get a hold of, the number of shootings would decrease. Okay, well, that's a testable theory. Access to guns throughout the history of this country was much easier than it is now. Let's just speak about the period, let's say, from the end of World War II on until 1995. Everybody could get a gun in America. You could walk into any hardware store in America and walk out with as many guns as you had money for. And not only that, your theory is that we need to ban things like the gun emoji on the iPhone. And by getting guns out of the public mind, if we just get guns out of the public consciousness, that will also reduce these mass shootings. Well, evidence is not only were guns easy to obtain in the past, much easier than they are today, but everybody played with guns back in the 50s and 60s. I don't know a single person my age who didn't have cap guns, who didn't have BB guns. So you are making an argument that is contravened by evidence. Guns were actually easier to get in the past, and everybody played with guns, toy guns, and we didn't have any of these shootings. It is an invalidation of your theory, with all due respect. So what's causing these things? I think this modern shooting period started with Columbine. I mean, remember Columbine being the first of these things. The Columbine kids called themselves the Black Mafia Gang. Now, I know their names, but you're never going to hear their names from me because, again, this is not like we don't have evidence. The person who is the greatest expert on mass shootings is a forensic psychologist named Park Dietz. And Park Dietz has said very clearly, if you want to stop these things in the future, here's what you have to do. Never show the face of the person that does the shooting. Never mention the person's name. Never, ever talk about body count. Never talk about how it compares to other things. Do localize the story, report it as the shooter, and you are taking the fame out of the equation. And if you don't think this is the truth, if you really think it is a question of throwing guns in the volcano in order to stop this, then I would point you to the most chilling line that I've ever heard, ever, in regard to all of these shootings, which was written by this kid, whose name I also know, and whose name you're never going to hear from me, nor are you going to see his picture on this segment. Because Park Dietz is right. But what this kid wrote in response to a previous shooting was, quote, "Man, I can do so much better." Okay? When speaking about a previous mass shooting, this kid said, "Man, I can do so much better." Okay? So it is already a contest for him. It's already a contest for an entire generation of people who have never been allowed to compete at anything. And so in regard to your specific question, Scott, about the idea of student activists and what can actually be done, I would simply say this. The police were sent to this guy's house, or authorities anyway, 39 times. Everybody knew that this was a bad kid. Sometimes they're just quiet and weird, but everybody knew that this was a bad kid. So I would simply urge the country to do what we've always understood was the right thing to do, which is to make this matter as far away from the federal government as possible. In other words, for every person that's capable of doing these mass murders, they're surrounded by hundreds of people who are perfectly good, decent people. And they know what's going on. So if you have suspicions about something, and you're close to your parents or other adults, your pastor or whatever, tell them what you've heard this person say, and then ask them for their opinion. And then they will make an adult decision as to whether or not this is something the police need to be involved with. And this is the early detection network. None of these kids go to school on their own, you know. All of them are surrounded by other kids who knew that they were nuts. The essence of the problem is this. In Columbine, these two murderers were called the Black Trenchcoat Gang because they were obsessed with the Matrix. The internet really hadn't completely fully come around yet. But they were obsessed by the Matrix. And they were building bombs in addition to all the guns that they'd hoarded. And after the shooting was over, the parents of these two murderers said, "We had no idea that this was going on." Okay, so if you are parents, and let's just take it at face value, because the alternative is that they didn't know they were going to do a shooting, but they knew they had problem kids. Maybe they said that in order to get some of the psychological weight off of their shoulders. But if you're telling me that your child is so disturbed that he's capable of going out and murdering people in cold blood, and you had no idea that this was a possibility, then somebody else needs to step up and do the responsibility that those parents have so clearly advocated. And the final thing I'll say about this is another one of these lines, like, man, I could do so much better, is related to the San Bernardino shooting, where people knew that this person was nuts. In fact, people saw him going into his house, going into his garage, and a number of people said, "I wanted to call the cops, but I didn't want to be accused of being a racist." Okay? So the responsibility is not with the federal government, it's not with ATF. All of the laws that they want, you shouldn't let felons or crazy people have guns. Guess what? Those laws are already on the books. And you want a simple solution. And your simple solution is to pass a law eliminating AK-47s as if that's going to solve anything. It's not. The societal threat is falling apart. These people would have been picked up in church. They would have been noticed in church, or by families, or by relatives, or by brothers or sisters, or by actual real friends who rode around with them on neighborhoods and bicycles and spent hours and hours and hours of real time with those people. They would have been caught a long time ago. When I say caught, I don't mean necessarily put in jail. I mean they would have been treated. Something would have happened prior to this. So that's what I would argue for this whole thing. But whether you think the theory of guns or not is true, understand that the FBI can't be every place, and you don't want to live in a world where they are. So you, students, are the responsible ones. You know who's borderline. You know who's making those threats. Nobody just suddenly goes to school, snaps, and murders, 30 people. It just doesn't happen. So, yes, you're absolutely right. Instead of calling for gun law changes, why don't you set up some kind of network where students can report people who they think are suspicious, and then without violating anybody's civil rights, we can look into the microscopically small percentage of the people who are actually capable of these kind of things.
If I were a thief and I had robbed some people's houses, I would love nothing better than for the local community to organize a series of protests to call for a national law to make it more difficult for thieves to get away with thievery. The last thing in the world I'd want them to do, though, is to lock their doors. I wouldn't want them to put their money in safes. I wouldn't want them to protect themselves. I'd want them to have theoretical discussions and legislative discussions about things that could be done at some distance in time and place in order for me to continue my activity. There's nothing better for these kinds of shooters who go around and do these things than for us to be caught up in a national debate over something that will not affect anything. As Bill has already pointed out, in every one of these shooting situations that we've heard in the last decade, every situation we can look at it and say, well, yeah, existing laws were in place that should have stopped that, but did not. The worst thing that we can teach our kids is to tell them that the answer to your life's problems is out there somewhere. It's far away. It's in somebody else's hands. It is tied up in a series of musty books, and if we can just add a few more codicils and paragraphs to those musty books, then somehow we're going to be safe. The best thing we can do is teach them to organize locally to protect themselves. If you really thought that there were people out there with guns who were coming to shoot your children, would you go to a protest? Would you write letters to your congressman? No, you'd protect your kids. You'd set up protective cordons at your schools. It's absurd how easy it is to walk into a school in this country. All these high schools that have 2,000 or 3,000 students, they're like small towns. They're like stadium events. It's much harder to get into a football game with a pint of rum than it is to get into the average school with an AR-15. You are responsible for your family's safety. You are responsible for your own safety. You are responsible in your community for your school. The protest should not be against Washington, D.C. It should be at the local school board meeting. It should be in the local schools saying, how can we organize right now to make sure that this never happens again here? Now, maybe someday they'll change the laws nationally in a way that we think will be salutary, but probably not. And even if they do change the laws, that's not going to protect us. Ultimately, when the bullet hits you, you're dead, whether you were a protester or somebody who ignored the protests. You need to be willing to stand up in your own community, to guard your own life, to protect your own children, and to organize at the local level. You want to be a revolutionary? You want to be a rebel? You want to make a difference in this world? Forget what the celebrities and the politicians are telling you and get organizing your neighborhood to protect your people. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.